We've got plenty of time for questions. If y'all have some, I will run back and forth with the mic. Or I can give the mic back to Graham, and I'm sure he will continue to tell us about the budget. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for your presentations. I think they were all very helpful and very interesting. Christine, you mentioned that it's always a balance between safety and consumer costs, and I think in my experience with rate cases, that seems to be a difficult topic, because one of the challenges is how do you value safety? Because we know what the dollars look like, but we don't really necessarily know how to value safety. What are you seeing in terms of how organizations who are in the AGA are really responding to that issue?
One of the things that thank you, Terry. One of the changes that I've seen, and it's really been over the last 5 to 10 years, is how do you do certain things faster? For example, replacement of cast iron and bare steel. About 5 years ago, there were a couple bad distribution incidents involving cast iron. And they were both in the same state, and I won't pick on that state. I'll try to be nice. But it was a state that we had been pushing to allow faster replacement. From the industry side, allow us to replace more. And what we were seeing was the commission not wanting to do that. You know, it's a 100-year-old pipe, and it should last another 100 years. And we're like, no, no, really, we don't want that. So Secretary LaHood actually helped jump in and did a call to action, and really asked the commissions to look at things slightly differently. And from that, it helped create what we call innovative rate mechanisms that allow operators to replace pipe faster without doing an undue impact on the customer. It's a different way of rate making, and I don't have all the gory details, but what I can tell you is when Secretary LaHood did that call to action, we had maybe about a dozen states that had embraced a similar concept. We now have 39 states and the District of Columbia. And if you think, okay, well, now you got 11 more states to go, we really don't. And here's why. If you look at the 11 states that are left, almost all of them are more modern materials. It's your plastic lines. They don't have cast iron, and they don't have bare steel. One of the states has the operator coming in annually for a rate case, so it's a constant churning. But it's one way that allows something that I believe has a true impact on public and pipeline safety to go faster. And there's also states that have that allow operators to recover faster costs for things like integrity management. A lot of the rate making is kind of like, okay, you spent this, and now you come in years later to show how much you spent. As opposed to forward-looking, here's how much we want to spend, and we'll let you spend that, and then you come in and you tell us, you assure us that you spent the money what you said, similar to what Monique was saying. Okay, but it allows you not to actually have the money in advance as opposed to waiting to get paid. And that allows you to do things at a faster rate. So all good things. We just need more things like that to happen.
More questions?
Come on, guys, we can fly down here for no questions. Somebody, John, Terry, somebody.
Well, doesn't the cost of the fines that are now being imposed have some effect on the so-called valuation of pipeline safety?
I'm happy to take that unless one of you wants
Yeah.
to. You're going to give it back to me again. I think, in case you haven't figured out, I'm not shy. Here's my opinion on fines. I think they have a place where you see an egregious wrong. I would personally rather see what, if you were in Jeff Weiss's presentation this morning, what he showed was fines and penalties, but he showed these other areas. One of those other areas is really, here's what we want you, the operator, to do to address this issue that we see. That goes immediately into pipeline safety. And typically, it's addressing, of course, the issue, but then going above and beyond. I like that because I know that is then impacting pipeline safety. If it's a fine and penalty, it goes in the coffers. It's not used for pipeline safety. Yeah.
Well,
But what about the projection of future fines? That's a question, whether that.
that's a bounty. You don't do that. That's not part of the analysis. You can't do it. Let me just, and this happens a lot in Washington too. We people use the term user fee, and we all think that we're using it the same way, and we're not. Again, remember, user fee, the concept of a user fee doesn't exist. There are exchange fees, there's user charges, there are exchange transactions, there's a whole series of government to commercial transactions covered in OMB circulars that characterize those transactions for purposes of scoring, characterizing the money, how it can be spent. Certain authority is inapplicable to certain fees unless the fee is scored a certain way. So there's some apples and some oranges that were, and maybe some pineapples in here in this, quote, user fee conversation. Christine and I are talking about two different user fees. What I'm talking about in my presentation is the analytic perspectives from OMB and CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and the scoring guidelines and rules that define what a user charge is that is eligible to be scored as an offsetting collection, which is what we enjoy at PHMSA now. The commercial transactions and business transactions up and down the stream between customers are not part of that analytics. PHMSA collects a fee under law right now, under 6301, and that is the defined fee. And for purposes of the definitions that matter in the guidance, the, quote, regulated community, the beneficiaries are established also by Congress when they set up the IMP, the Integrity Management Program for Transmission. The DIP is part of that. And those sectors are what Congress has created for purposes of comparing from whom the fee is collected and to whom it benefits. The commercial transactions and business transactions in which allocated costs are ensconced within those commercial transactions on the private side are not part of the analytic regime that Congress and the White House and the government will impose and does impose on this regime. And they are not what the Senate Appropriations Committee was examining when it said that over the years, the authorizing committees have themselves enlarged the regulatory burden on PHMSA by adding new sectors. That analysis does not include the issue of business to business or commercial to commercial transactions on the private side. So just, this is kind of a gratuitous trying to keep these different discussions discrete because they may seem to flow into one another when you describe it all as a user fee, but the legal reality, and that's what we have to deal with in Congress, is more discrete and more specified than that. As far as penalties go, penalties do get dumped back in, but you cannot budget penalties in an advance appropriation or any other way.
No, I purely meant that, to do the previous question, how does one value safety? And so that might be something that the operators might want to consider.
I don't know of a single operator that would ever want a pipeline incident. And so I know for AGA's members, we spend about $19 billion annually to ensure safety. Why do we do that? Well, for us, we live and work in the communities we serve. So if something happens, we're there, we're impacted. But you also heard, even from a business standpoint, this morning, there was a discussion by Administrator Dominguez about the value of the company after a major incident. She was talking about the airline industry. So not only do you have now a bad reputation, your stock price goes down. Any way you slice and dice it, safety is foremost in the mind of the company. You want to keep the product in the line. You spend a lot of time and resources to do that. For AJ's members, unfortunately, our biggest issue is two things: people digging into our lines and people running into our lines. When you look at corrosion and you look at some of the other elements, they're pretty small. We're now focused on things, and regulations will only get you so far. And this, I think we heard a little bit about that earlier today. I know AGA's members are doing a lot far outside of regulation. And if I just named 3, and I could name a whole list, but we're doing peer-to-peer reviews where we have subject matter experts from other companies coming in to do an analysis of a company on specific areas like safety culture and pipeline safety and employee safety. And it's typically individuals with 20 to 30 years of experience asking really hard questions of a lot of different people to figure out what the company's doing well and opportunities to improve. That's not part of a regulation. It's just how do we think things a little bit better. We have a best practices program that allows companies to benchmark themselves and learn from the best. We do a lot of conferences and workshops. I just did a safety summit earlier this week, and also a cyber summit. We did back-to-back on 2 big issues because those are important to us. Again, outside of regulation, but we're thinking about this a lot, and we're doing a lot in this area. Can we do more? I'm always looking for new ways. Sure.
Christine is exactly right. And Inga, I think I've started my remarks with pointing out that the amount of funding that's spent for safety on an annual basis by our operators is vastly exceeds anything close to the fees that are paid here to PHMSA for safety regulation. It's in the billions of dollars. And she's exactly right. Nobody owns a multi-billion-dollar pipeline transmission facility and wants to see anything bad happen to it. The costs, the consequences of that to the operator compared to the fee it's not even close. So there's nobody that's more incentivized to operate these things safely, rehab them, and keep them functioning than the operators. That's their business. When the thing breaks, they're out of business, and that's bad for business. So if it may be that what you were trying to get at was when you said, do people factor in a value from a penalty? I think maybe the way operators think about it is that we spend everything we have to make these systems operate safely all the time because we know the cost of them not operating safely. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Monica, this is really for you. I'm talking about the focus on safety, and I think we heard earlier that regulation isn't going to be enough to get us to 0 incidents, which is everyone's goal. Is FERC thinking about that in terms of rate recovery? I know you mentioned that the policy really talks about recovery for implementing past regulations or new regulations. But I think what PHMSA is really talking about is going above and beyond the regulations. And so the question really is FERC thinking about how do we recover, how do operators recover in those circumstances where they've gone above and beyond?
When the commission came up with the policy statement, the commission said the baseline is pipeline should already be doing, they have in their rates O&M recovery. So they're already recovering some amount for O&M. And so the policy statement for the surcharge or tracker was when the pipeline goes above and beyond. And so because this is a policy and not a rule, the pipeline and the shippers have great flexibility as to the contours of what should be included in the surcharge recovery. And so as the pipeline is negotiating with the shippers and vice versa, I think the pipeline has broad latitude in determining what should be included and how it's included. And to the extent there is shipper support and it otherwise meets the framework, the commission has provided great flexibilities if the pipeline does go above and beyond.
Thanks. Was that an arm raise or no? Okay.
Okay, here's a question, and there are some shippers on intrastate pipelines, but a shipper can either be a local distribution company that wants to have gas delivered to them, or it could be a production company that wants to sell their gas to somebody, and they want to ship on that. Or it could be a manufacturing plant. And obviously, they've got different choices on how they're going to get their gas and stuff like that. Do you see any differences in the shippers and their opinion on paying for these services?
I think that's going to her.
I think that's a yes, but that's all I mean.
We're all showing in your direction.
Obviously, in comments, you see different opinions depending on which sector. And even in the Columbia case, you had state commissions commenting as well, because it's going to flow through, if an LDC is, on Columbia or the pipeline, it's going to flow through to us. And so, yes, there is a divergence of opinions among shippers and commenters in these proceedings. And the proceedings are open. You don't necessarily have to be a shipper. You can intervene and get the information and file comments, how much your comments weigh. Obviously, if you're not a part of the pipeline, they may not listen to you, but they may. I don't know. I'm not in those discussions. So, yes, there is a divergence among shippers.
Let me add another concept to that. PHMSA is at the Transportation Department for a reason, and this conversation today to me is indicative of the commingling of the issues of the costs and the, quote, fairness of the business transactions for the product, the shipper side, and transportation. It's at DOT because the construct is the transportation. And there are different segments of the transportation, which is the PHMSA regulation. The issue of the product and who has to pay what and who gets charged for the product is a different regime. And it's reflected right here. We have a FERC person and a DOT person. I'll impute that, at least I used to be. And these are two different regimes that are governing two different things. The safety of the road that the product is traveling on, and a separate issue of the cost of the product that's traveling down the road. They're two different things. What I'm here to talk to and did talk to about this was how the road or the pipeline and the series of roads, so we have different kinds of roads, we have interstates, we have bridges, we have local roads, they get paid for differently. They get regulated by DOT. The value of the product going down that road and who paid for it, at what cost, under what circumstances, is a separate issue from was the road safe or not. But this gets complicated, and the language tends to make it sound like it's all one big regime. It's not. There's a reason why FERC governs its part of it, and if you look at Chapter 60 of Title 49, you will see FERC written into 63-300 for a reason. And they have a very specific issue there that they regulate on their side that's completely separate from PHMSA. And the transportation issue, which is with pipelines, which is what PHMSA regulates. So I'm coming back and trying to just keep the analytics of what people are discussing here separate, because it may seem like one thing in this room, But I guarantee you, when you get to Congress, it's not. There are different committees of jurisdictions, there's different rules, and how this works up there does come back and impact what you're trying to achieve here, what we're trying to achieve, which is a safe regime. And how the regulator gets paid for matters there.